The wire blew at 2:17, and I was still pulling my boots on when the first figures came through the gap. I heard the charge go before I felt it, a flat crack that punched the air out of the mountain night, followed immediately by a roar of voices and the hard stutter of automatic fire from the eastern perimeter. I grabbed my rifle off the cot hook, slapped a magazine in without thinking, and ran. The compound at Kestrel Post was small enough that everything was 30 seconds from everything else, but 30 seconds felt very long with rounds snapping overhead and a man somewhere in the dark yelling for a medic. Sergeant Tillman was already at the gate wall, crouched behind a HESCO barrier with his arm bleeding and his voice cutting through the noise. 3 men from Second Squad were down at the wire, the barrier rolling back from the breach like a torn seam. I counted at least 7 muzzle flashes inside 50 meters of the gap. Alpha Team was trying to set a defensive line along the eastern HESCO wall and getting chewed apart doing it. Corporal Bates was firing in controlled bursts from the corner of the comms shack. The machine gun on the northern wall had gone silent. I found out later the gunner had taken a round through the shoulder and gone off the weapon. Nobody was thinking about my sister. She had arrived on the afternoon resupply bird, just a name on the manifest listed as dependent travel, which is what the system calls it when a soldier's family member catches a military hop out to a forward post. I had not seen her in 2 years. She looked thinner than I remembered, and quieter in a way I could not quite place, with a particular way of standing in doorways and watching things that seemed, at the time, like nothing in particular. She wore civilian clothes and carried one soft-sided bag. She signed the visitor log at the front of the command post without ceremony, and Sergeant Tillman, who was behind the desk at the time, had barely acknowledged her beyond checking the name. I watched him clock her, the civilian jacket, the worn bag, the quiet posture, and file her away in about 1 second flat. He said something to Corporal Bates after she stepped outside that made Bates laugh. I was too far away to hear the exact words, but I understood the shape of it well enough. She was the visiting sister. Baby Carver's family from back home, come to see the outpost and take some pictures and ride back on the next available bird. That was the whole story, as far as Tillman was concerned, and as far as most of the post was concerned. Later that afternoon she had been standing at the edge of the vehicle compound looking up at the ridgeline to the north, just standing there, watching, with that stillness I now recognize and did not then. Tillman had walked past with Bates and said it clearly enough for her to hear, "Private Carver's sister. Came all the way up here so baby brother doesn't have to feel alone at his first post." He did not say it with particular cruelty. It was more like he was simply stating the obvious, the way you state a fact that requires no argument. Bates laughed. She kept looking at the ridge without turning. I felt the heat in my face and I said nothing. I was 6 weeks at Kestrel Post. I was still learning the order of things. The ridge she had been watching was exactly where the secondary element came from, 2 hours later. Now the breach was open, 4 men were down or out of the fight, and Tillman was working a field dressing around his forearm with one hand and his teeth. I came up behind the HESCO on his left side and got my rifle into a firing position. There were figures in the gap using the rolled wire as partial cover, and more of them on the outer perimeter trying to flank around to the northern wall corner. The angle was bad. I fired twice and confirmed nothing. She appeared at my left side. I did not see her coming. One moment that space was empty, and the next she was there in a low crouch, moving along the inside of the HESCO with Corporal Vasquez's rifle in her hands. I did not know how she had obtained Vasquez's rifle and did not ask. She was in a firing position before I could process any of it, left elbow seated on the top edge of the HESCO, the barrel moving in a slow, controlled arc across the gap. She held perfectly still. I said, "You have to get back. You need to get behind cover." She said, "Count the muzzle flashes with me." "Not yet." Her voice was level, not the kind of calm that comes from not understanding the danger. The kind that comes from having been here before, in some form or another, enough times that the body has learned to function cleanly inside it. I know that difference now. I did not entirely then. We counted together. 7 distinct positions in the gap. 2 more men working the outer wire, heading toward the northern wall corner where they would have an angle on the machine gun position. She said the 2 on the outer wire first before they reached the corner, then the gap left to right. She paused one breath. Ready. I said okay. She fired twice. The 2 men on the outer wire went down. Clean shots. The second round came so close behind the first that the 2 sounds nearly merged in the mountain air. She shifted 3 inches right, acquired, and fired again. A muzzle flash in the gap stopped. She was moving her point of aim left when she fired the 4th shot, then the 5th, then the 6th. Between each round there was a pause of about 1.5 seconds, not because she was working slowly, but because she was making each one account for something specific. Position, angle, the cover the target was using, where the cover ended and where it did not. 6 rounds. 6 positions accounted for. The gap went quiet. Tillman, from behind the HESCO to my right, shouted something I could not make out over the ringing in my ears. I looked back and he was staring at my sister with an expression that was not recognition yet, but was the beginning of it, a hard recalibration that a man does when the world has shown him something that does not fit his working model of how things operate. Then the machine gun on the ridge opened up. The secondary element had come around the north slope while we were occupied with the gap, a crew-served weapon team, set up on a granite shelf at roughly 400 meters, working down the angle at our observation post on the northern lip of the compound. The first burst went over the op by several feet. The second burst walked closer. Whoever was behind that weapon knew what he was doing and was correcting. She was already scanning the ridge before the second burst finished. She turned and said to me, "Where is your longest optic?" I pointed to the sniper platform, a plywood deck mounted on the water storage rack at the back of the compound, 8 feet off the ground, where Sergeant Morrow kept a bolt action with a variable power scope for observation work. She was moving before I finished the gesture. She crossed the compound in a low run, one hand on the rail, pulled herself up the ladder without slowing, and went flat behind the bolt action. I watched her settle into the rifle. The adjustments she made took no more than 6 seconds. Cheek weld, natural point of aim, 2 turns of the elevation knob, then half a turn back. Then she was absolutely still. She fired once. The machine gun on the ridge stopped. She worked the bolt without lifting her head, acquired a second target, and fired again. A muzzle flash at a different position, one I had not located, one our perimeter had not engaged, went dark. She had identified that position in the time it took me to cross the compound and reach the base of the storage rack. The third round she fired struck a man on a rock shelf who was attempting to set up a second crew-served weapon. I know this because Sergeant Morrow told me the following morning, in precise detail, what he observed through the spotter scope when he climbed up to relieve her. He described 2 men behind the granite shelf at 420 meters, both engaged at angles that left no question about the quality of the read. She had seen where the cover ended and where it did not, and she had fired accordingly. Her grouping across 3 separate targets at varying ranges, from a cold rifle she had never fired in the dark under fire. She stayed on the platform for 12 minutes after the last shot, scanning the ridgeline in a slow, methodical arc, section by section, not moving off the optic until she had gone over every shadow and rock seam at least twice. When she came down, she handed the bolt action to Morrow, who had arrived at the base of the rack with a spotter scope and a pale, quiet expression. She said to him, "The scope is 2 clicks low at 400. You will want to re-zero before first light. There may be a follow-on attempt before dawn." She said it the same way you would tell someone their shoelace was undone. Morrow said, "Yes, ma'am." She nodded once, descended the ladder, and walked back across the compound. The quick reaction force from Dalmore Station came in 40 minutes later. Lieutenant Garza, the QRF commander, conducted his assessment and spent several minutes with the sergeant major. Then the sergeant major called Tillman and Bates to a corner of the command post. I was outside helping drag HESCO panels back to the breach when that conversation happened. I did not hear what was said. But I watched Tillman's face when he came out, and a man's face is its own kind of after-action report. What the sergeant major had placed in front of them, what Garza had drawn from the file on his way to Kestrel Post, was this. Her full name was Sergeant First Class Elena Carver. The unit designation in her paperwork corresponded to a special operations element operating 600 miles south, whose operators do not announce themselves on resupply manifests or visitor logs. She had been selected for that unit after finishing first in her advanced sniper qualification course, 12 candidates in the class, 11 of them carrying prior combat deployments. Her scores at the advanced CQB program had been the highest recorded in 2 consecutive training cycles. She had 3 previous combat deployments in theaters and in roles that were listed in the file and discussed nowhere outside it. She had come to Kestrel Post on her own time on leave, on a personal visit, because her brother was 6 weeks into his first deployment, and she wanted to see that he was all right. None of that had been visible in the civilian jacket, and the soft-sided bag, and the quiet way she stood in doorways watching ridgelines. Garza found her at the base of the storage rack, going through the bolt actions mechanism with care, working the bolt, checking each round seating and ejection, running a small brush through the firing assembly from her bag, the way you maintain a weapon after a fight, because the weapon earned that care and you know it. He watched her for a moment. Then he came to attention and held it. He said, "We'll arrange transport back to your element before first light, SFC Carver. The sergeant major sends his personal respects and his gratitude." She said, "Tell him the men on the wire held the line. They were in position and covering the breach before I arrived. That deserves its own entry." She handed the bolt action to Morrow. "2 clicks up," she said, "before dawn." Morrow said, "Yes, ma'am." Garza held his position of attention one more beat than the situation strictly required. Then he left. I walked with her to the comms shack where she had left her bag. The compound was settling into the work of recovery QRF personnel setting the outer perimeter, others working the breach, the light on in the aid station at the eastern building. The mountain air had the smell of cold stone and spent propellant. She zipped her bag, slung it over one shoulder, and looked at me without any performance in her expression. I said, "You should have told me what you were, what you could do." She considered that. Not as a deflection, she actually turned it over the way she turned everything over, with the same patient precision she had given the ridgeline scan. She said, "If I had told you, you would have had a story about me. Now you have something you actually know. The difference matters more than you might think." I said I had no idea. She said, "You knew I was your sister. That was enough reason to give me the benefit of the doubt." She picked up her bag. "Write Mom when you can. She worries about the elevation up here." Then she walked across the compound toward the transport, and I stood at the door of the comms shack and watched her go, and I did not call after her because there was nothing I could say that would add anything to what the night had already said completely. Tillman came and stood beside me a few minutes later. We watched the transport lights across the compound in silence. After a long time he said, "Your sister." I said, "Yeah." He said, "She's something else." It was not elaborate. It was not an apology. It was a man arriving at an accurate conclusion after the evidence had been presented to him in the only language that kind of evidence comes in: action, result, the final accounting. I accepted it for what it was, which was more than some men would have offered. In the morning, Morrow had re-zeroed the scope. He had also entered the engagement into the observation log with a care that went well beyond the standard format: precise times, positions, engagement distances, and confirmed results noted in his close handwriting. At the bottom of the entry in his small block letters, SFC E. Carver, engagements 217 to 304. All positions confirmed. He left the log open on the observation desk, where anyone climbing up to the platform would see it first thing. When I asked him why he had done it that way, he said it seemed right to have a proper record. Some things, he said, should not be left to memory alone. I have gone back to Kestrel Post twice in the years since, long after the enlistment was done and other work had taken me elsewhere. The compound is larger now, the buildings replaced, the equipment updated. The plywood platform is still there, though the storage rack has been rebuilt and the compound expanded on the eastern side. The men who hold the post now do not know the name. Most of them had not yet put on a uniform on the night the wire came down. But Morrow is still in service, and he still tells the story when the conversation warrants it, which it does sometimes among soldiers who have been in long enough to understand that the best instruction comes from the things you actually witnessed. He does not begin with the tactical numbers or the positions or the precise sequence of the engagement. He begins with a woman in civilian clothes who climbed a plywood ladder in the middle of a firefight, placed 8 rounds that stopped an attack from 2 axes, came down, handed a rifle to a sergeant, and informed him his scope was off by 2 clicks. He says, that is what it looks like when a person has made themselves into something, completely and without reservation, with nothing left unfinished in the making. I was 22 years old on that mountain. I have carried what I learned that night through every year since, and what I carry most is not the memory of the shooting or the tactical detail. It is the memory of the way she handed back the rifle carefully, correctly, with no interest in being watched doing it. She had done what was needed. The compound was intact. Her brother was alive. That completed her accounting. She was already thinking about the scope and the dawn. I am still working on that kind of discipline. I expect I will be for some time.